The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant rumble of waves against steel hulls. The Pacific stretched endlessly under a starless sky, an ocean cloaked in shadows where secrets waited to be unleashed. Japan's fleet, proud and confident, cut through those black waters with the arrogance of a nation that had dominated the early years of the war. Their destroyers glided forward like predators, their decks lined with soldiers who believed they were untouchable. Over 3,500 men, trained, armed, and assured that the Empire's might would carry them to victory. But what they did not know was that death itself was stalking them. Silent, unseen, and American. Far beyond the horizon, hidden in the darkness, U.S. forces were preparing for a strike so devastating, it would not only shatter Japan's steel, but also ignite a rage that would ripple through Tokyo like wildfire. The Americans had waited for this moment, perfecting their strategy, sharpening their weapons, and choosing the precise time when the Japanese fleet was most vulnerable. This was not just another skirmish on the high seas. This was a turning point, a night when the Pacific would run red, and the Empire of Japan would taste fury unlike anything it had endured before. You can almost hear it if you close your eyes, the faint hum of engines, the whispers of commanders, the sharp click of torpedo safeties being released. Every man on the American side knew what was at stake. One chance, one strike, one brutal ambush that could save thousands of lives on the front lines or plunge them all into disaster. The Japanese destroyers pressed forward, escorting transports carrying reinforcements. To them, it was routine. To the Americans, it was an opportunity carved out of fate. And in the pitch black of night, opportunity would soon turn into carnage. The clock ticked past midnight. The ocean itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the shadows, America's guns roared. The night exploded. Columns of water and fire erupted as shells from America's heavy naval guns found their marks. Torpedoes screamed through the waves, striking steel with a deafening boom that tore destroyers apart as though they were made of paper. In a heartbeat, Japan's formation descended into chaos. Alarms blared. Officers shouted. Soldiers scrambled in confusion as their decks shuddered beneath the force of explosions. Men were thrown overboard by the sheer violence of the blasts. Fire consumed the sky. The Japanese had expected dominance. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare of American precision. And in that instant, more than 3,500 Japanese soldiers realized that their fate was sealed. The Americans weren't simply fighting. They were sending a message. But pause here for a second. Imagine you are standing on that deck, the air thick with smoke, the screams of your comrades mixing with the roar of collapsing steel. Imagine the ocean beneath you boiling from fire and blood, the sky torn apart by streaks of tracer fire. Would you survive? Would you even have the courage to look back at the flames? This, my friends, is just the beginning of the story. And if you've made it this far, if you feel the tension crawling under your skin, then you already know how gripping this journey is going to be. That's why I want you to do something important right now. Hit that like button, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this story. Because what comes next, the destruction, the losses, the rage of an empire scorned, is something you need to witness to believe. Now, back to the battle. The Japanese destroyers tried desperately to regroup. Searchlights cut through the darkness, beams scanning across the ocean to find the hidden enemy. But for every glimpse of a shadowed hull, another American salvo thundered in. The sky was alive with artillery, each round tearing through the night with an unrelenting rhythm of destruction. Boom, boom, boom. Every hit was a dagger to the Japanese Navy's pride. Every sinking ship was a wound that bled not only soldiers, but also the Empire's confidence. Japanese commanders barked orders, trying to restore order to the chaos. But the ocean itself had turned against them. Fires spread across decks, ammunition stores detonated in chain reactions, and within minutes, destroyers that had once embodied power were reduced to burning skeletons sinking into the abyss. Survivors clung to debris, their cries lost in the roar of the ocean. The Americans, relentless and merciless, kept pressing forward. They knew hesitation meant giving Japan a chance to counter. There could be no mercy. Not here. Not tonight. By the time the first hour of battle passed, the Japanese fleet was in ruins. Several destroyers had already slipped beneath the waves, their crews dragged into watery graves. Entire battalions of soldiers, men who had dreamed of returning home as heroes, were swallowed by the sea. Over 3,500 souls lost. And with every sinking ship, Japan's fury grew hotter. Because this wasn't just a military loss. It was humiliation. An empire that had once stunned the world with Pearl Harbor, that had terrorized the Pacific with ruthless precision, was now watching its own strength disintegrate in fire and blood. And the culprit was America, the nation they had believed was too soft, too slow, too weak to match their discipline. Now, that very nation was striking back with vengeance, and the results were undeniable. The Pacific War had turned a corner, and Japan knew it. But what no one on that battlefield realized, not the American gunners, not the Japanese soldiers drowning in the waves, not even the commanders watching from their flagships, was that this single night would ignite a chain reaction. A fury that would change the way Japan fought, and a confidence in America that would carry its forces all the way to ultimate victory. This was more than a battle. It was a message written in fire across the Pacific, and it was only the beginning. The ocean was no longer silent. Where once the night had been calm and endless, now it was alive with fury. Explosions ripped across the black surface, towering columns of fire and water bursting into the sky. The sea, which had cradled Japan's pride and strength, had turned into its coffin. The Japanese destroyers, sleek and deadly machines of war, twisted and reeled under the sudden ferocity of America's ambush. Shells slammed into their decks, tearing through steel and splintering wood, igniting fuel stores and scattering men like broken dolls. Torpedoes carved through the water with deadly precision, striking home with thunderous detonations that snapped keels in half. Men screamed. Flames devoured paint, rope, and flesh alike. The night was no longer a cloak for the Japanese fleet. It was a trap that suffocated them in smoke and death. Commanders barked desperate orders, their voices nearly drowned by the roar of guns. Engage. Return fire. Find the enemy. Searchlights swung wildly across the horizon, cutting jagged white beams through the chaos. For a moment, one beam caught the shadowed silhouette of an American warship, its massive guns recoiling in rhythm, fire leaping from its barrels. The Japanese destroyers opened up with everything they had, but by the time their shells reached the target, the American vessel was already gone, swallowed by darkness and speed. Every minute was a duel of survival. The Japanese fleet had come prepared for escort duty, not annihilation. Their holds were crowded with soldiers bound for distant battlefields. Many of these men never even made it to the deck. When the first torpedoes hit, entire compartments filled with seawater in seconds. Hundreds were trapped, their fists pounding against sealed bulkheads as the ocean claimed them. Above, those who managed to climb topside found only more terror. Firestorms, collapsing masts, and fragments of twisted steel slicing through the air. By now, the Americans had locked onto their prey. Their strategy was clear: overwhelm the Japanese quickly, give no time to regroup, and drive home the advantage with merciless precision. Every blast was calculated, every maneuver designed to push the enemy deeper into confusion. The Japanese tried to answer. Guns thundered back into the night, arcs of tracers reaching desperately for invisible targets. Some shells found the water near American ships, geysers rising where a hit might have been. But luck was not on their side. For every attempt, America replied with double the force. Another destroyer shuddered under the blow of a direct hit. Its stern erupted in a brilliant fireball as the engine room was ripped apart. Flames spread across the deck, ammunition began to cook off, and within minutes the ship was a floating torch, illuminating the battlefield for miles. Men jumped overboard to escape the inferno, only to find themselves swallowed by waves already littered with wreckage and bodies. The soldiers aboard the transports fared no better. These massive carriers of manpower were floating coffins once the American shells began to find them. A single hit could tear through the packed holds, killing hundreds at once. Soldiers who had been writing letters home only hours before now found themselves buried beneath collapsing steel. The transports listed, their decks tilting as men scrambled to the rails, diving into waters that churned with oil and blood. The Pacific, once vast and serene, had become a slaughterhouse. Yet amid this destruction, the Japanese fought with a desperation born of pride. Crews manned their guns to the very end, even as flames licked at their feet. Officers screamed commands with voices hoarse from smoke. Entire batteries continued firing until the ships beneath them split apart and sank. For the Empire, there could be no surrender. But valor could not outmatch devastation. America's advantage was overwhelming. Their naval guns pounded with a rhythm that seemed endless, like the beating of war drums echoing across the night. Each shell carved death into the water, into steel, into flesh. Their destroyers and cruisers moved with deadly coordination, circling like wolves around a wounded prey. The Japanese formation unraveled. What had begun as an organized convoy was now nothing but isolated wrecks, burning silhouettes drifting apart, their survivors scattered and leaderless. Signals grew frantic. Codebooks opened in panic as commanders tried to call reinforcements. But by the time their messages reached distant headquarters, it was already too late. The Americans had carved their mark. Bodies floated among the wreckage, some clinging to life, others already lifeless, faces turned upward to the indifferent stars. Survivors struggled onto rafts, their eyes reflecting the glow of their sinking comrades' ships. For them, there was no victory, only the haunting knowledge that they had witnessed the Empire's might reduced to embers. And yet, for the Japanese command, the greatest wound was not the loss of men. It was the humiliation. For years, the Empire had ruled the night seas, dominating the Pacific with swift destroyer tactics and an aura of invincibility. But here, in this single battle, that illusion shattered. America had proven it could strike, and strike harder than Japan ever anticipated. By dawn, when the smoke began to drift away and the ocean quieted once more, the devastation was undeniable. Several destroyers had vanished beneath the waves. Transports lay broken, their troops gone forever. Over 3,500 Japanese soldiers, the pride of their homeland, the strength meant to fuel their campaigns, were dead, swallowed by the sea. The ocean itself seemed stained with the Empire's anger. Japan was not simply defeated. It was humiliated. And humiliation breeds fury. Word of the disaster would travel fast, from commanders' reports to Tokyo's war council to the emperor himself. The Empire would rage, vowing vengeance against the enemy who had dared to tear apart their fleet. But no matter how furious, no matter how determined, the truth was carved into the waves. Japan had suffered one of its darkest nights, and America's shadow was only growing larger. This was not the end of the story. It was the spark. Because when Japan rose from these ashes, its anger would fuel battles bloodier and more desperate than ever before. And the Pacific, vast and merciless, would drink deeper still from the sacrifices of nations at war. The sun rose over the Pacific with an eerie calm, as though the ocean itself sought to bury the horrors of the night. The surface glittered in gold, but beneath those waves lay the twisted remains of Japan's pride, broken hulls, shattered steel, and the bodies of thousands who would never see their homeland again. The war-torn sea had swallowed them without mercy. For the survivors, dawn was not salvation. It was a reminder of despair. Clinging to debris, rafts, and oil-slicked planks, they floated in silence, their eyes hollow, their faces ash-gray from exhaustion and grief. Many whispered prayers. Others stared blankly at the horizon, haunted by the screams of comrades that still echoed in their minds. The crackle of fire from sinking transports faded slowly, but its smoke lingered, a black scar across the morning sky. American ships moved calmly in the distance, silhouettes of victors surveying the battlefield. Where Japanese sailors saw destruction, America saw triumph. Their war machine had worked flawlessly, and the Pacific now bore testimony to their dominance. They had not just attacked, they had dismantled an entire formation, reducing thousands of soldiers and sailors into nameless casualties. On the Japanese side, news of the disaster spread like wildfire. Signals and dispatches carried the grim truth back to command posts. At first, disbelief reigned. How could destroyers, the pride of Japan's naval strategy, fall so swiftly, so brutally? How could thousands of soldiers vanish in one night, drowned before they ever set foot on the battlefield? But disbelief soon turned into rage. The War Council in Tokyo seethed. Generals slammed their fists on polished tables. Admirals spoke of vengeance, of retribution that would strike at America's heart. The empire could not, would not, allow such humiliation to stand. This was no mere defeat. This was an insult carved into Japan's honor. For the Japanese people, the truth came in whispers. Official reports softened the numbers, yet rumors bled through. Whispers of thousands dead, of transports lost, of a sea turned red with the lifeblood of sons and fathers. Families waited for letters that would never arrive. Mothers lit incense for boys who had been swallowed by the waves. The empire demanded silence, but grief is a force that cannot be buried. Yet amidst this mourning, there was something more dangerous: resolve. Japan had been pushed into a corner. Its leaders knew that this loss was more than tactical. It was psychological. America had shown that it could strike hard, without hesitation, and leave devastation in its wake. If Japan faltered now, the illusion of its invincibility would collapse entirely. And so, the empire tightened its grip, preparing for battles fiercer, bloodier, and more desperate than anything yet seen. Meanwhile, the survivors, the few who escaped the inferno, carried stories that would haunt them forever. Men spoke of explosions so powerful they felt the very ocean split beneath their feet. They recalled friends consumed by fire in an instant, or swallowed by waves while begging for help that never came. Some remembered the eerie silence that followed the destruction, broken only by the cries of the dying and the hiss of sinking ships. They were not just survivors. They were living ghosts of a night that had scarred the empire. For America, this was victory, but not one without consequence. Their dominance at sea was undeniable, yet each strike only hardened Japan's will to resist. Every destroyer sunk, every soldier lost, was another ember feeding the empire's fury. The Pacific was vast, and while America had dealt a devastating blow, the war was far from over. Both nations now stood at a crossroads. Japan, humiliated and grieving, burned with vengeance. America, emboldened and confident, pressed forward with renewed determination. The ocean between them became a chessboard of steel and fire, where every move carried the weight of thousands of lives. The clash would only intensify, growing deadlier, until one side was forced into silence. And yet, no matter how many battles would follow, the memory of that night remained etched into history. A night when over 3,500 Japanese soldiers never reached their destination. A night when several destroyers, the pride of an empire, were reduced to twisted wreckage beneath the sea. A night when America proved that the Pacific would no longer belong to Japan. The ocean itself seemed to whisper the story. To the waves, it did not matter who was right or wrong, who was conqueror or conquered. It only remembered the blood, the fire, and the screams that faded into silence. For the men who lived through it, that silence was unbearable. For the empire, it was unforgivable. And for history, it was unforgettable. The Pacific had claimed its price, and war, merciless, unrelenting war, would demand far more before its hunger was satisfied.